All right, so what we're going to talk about today, last week, Sarah talked about Jews and day-to-day life, what that was like. And so today we're going to talk some about the history of Judaism at the time of Jesus and what that was like, so that to sort of expand our understanding of context of Jesus' ministry, which we spend a lot of time doing, and which I'm grateful and glad that we do, because our studies have definitely expanded, and the depth of our questioning has definitely expanded my own understandings and beliefs. And Maisie is just really getting into everything. Sorry. All right, so I'm going to share first some general history, and then I wanted to, this is the book that I used for the bulk of today's lesson, The Misunderstood Jew, the Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus. And it is by a woman named Amy Jill Levine, who is Jewish. And I'll talk more about her in a few minutes. But first, to put things sort of in a historical context, and some of this we've sort of talked about before, and as you guys have knowledge or things to add in, please do so, because Harold, I know you do. So I, it takes all of us. So just to put some context, and we've talked before about how Israel and that area of the world was very Greek, very strong Greek influences, that everybody knew Greek, but Aramaic for the Jews would have been day-to-day language. So, and that they became that Greek influence because of Alexander the Great and his wide-ranging conquests of the world at that time. And that goes back to the 4th century BC. So there had been, for about 400 years, those Greek cultural influences. And then in about 63 BC is when the Romans came in to that part of the world. And so they, as we know, they were pretty much in control as far as the government. They had established a relationship with the Sadducees, and we'll talk about that some more in a minute. So that general historical context, getting closer to the time frame of Jesus's time. You remember back when we did the Apocrypha, and we did the 1st through 4th Maccabees, 1st Maccabees, 2nd Maccabees, 3rd Maccabees, 4th Maccabees. I don't have a whole lot of memory of that, so maybe you guys do. But basically what Maccabees is about is fighting the Roman or fighting the Greeks. All right, fighting the Greeks to reestablish Jewish control over that land. Okay, so that was in about the 2nd century BC, so about 200 years before Christ. And the Greeks at that point had really clamped down. They desecrated the temple in multiple ways. They banned circumcision. They forced Jews to eat pork. Jews who abandoned their Jewish traditions for Greek ones were clearly favored by the Greek rulers. So the Maccabean revolt is the stories of the Jews overcoming and overthrowing the Greeks. So, but it turned out that the Maccabeans were better fighters than rulers. So what they did, they really struggled to establish rule within their own land. So they formed an alliance with the Romans. And so that's how the Romans came into that part of the world, to Israel. And it was particularly the Sadducees that formed that alliance with Rome. And because of that alliance, the Sadducees were allowed by Rome to have control over the temple. So remember, we've talked before about how it was the Sadducees that governed the temple. Well, that's how it came about, was through that process. So there were other sort of groups or philosophies, as some ancient historians referred to them, within the Jewish community. There were, and we've heard these names before, the Essenes, the Zealots, and the Pharisees. All right, and we've heard all of those. We've heard of those too, right? Those are familiar names. Those three groups, the Essenes, the Zealots, and the Pharisees, they were oftentimes at odds with the Sadducees. All right. So even within the Jewish realm or Jewish world at that time, there were varying opinions, varying philosophies, varying approach to how to govern the world. And ironically, most Jews did not belong to any of these four groups. Most did not. So the everyday Jew probably didn't. The Essenes, Sarah, you want to talk a little bit about the Essenes, because you talked about them last week.
The Essenes tried to keep the purity laws as if they were priests. They lived in a separate community. There's some disagreement as to whether women were part of this community or not, but they had lots of baths. And if you remember, I think I said this last week, the ritual purity that you have to go through before you can go into the temple has to be with running water, with living water, not water drawn from a well. And the archaeologists have found where the Essenes lived, and lots of pools that would have only been filled with flood water once a year. So you can imagine how clean it was right before the floods. But they took the purity laws to the ultimate. Is the main thing about them. They were kept themselves separate from the rest of the Jews. Felt like most of the rest of the Jews just didn't know what they were doing, weren't doing it right.
Yeah.
So,
we've talked about Qumran before, those scrolls at Qumran that were found in the caves, and those discoveries started right after World War II, somewhere in there. And a Bedouin, this guy just sort of roaming through the countryside, found this cave and went inside and found these clay jars that had lids on them. And it turns out it had these ancient scrolls, and a good portion of them are from this time period of Jesus' life, roughly this time period. And it's the Essenes that stored this stuff in the caves at Qumran. So the name Qumran is the name of the little village or whatever in that area. So that's the significance of the Essenes, and it's thought that John the Baptist was perhaps an Essene. So there weren't any membership cards or that kind of thing. So we don't have any membership rolls or to verify it. But
they also primary was they believed only in spiritual things being worthwhile. The physical was not worthwhile. And I've read some scholars, or what do you want to call them, that felt that Jesus might have been an Essene also, if you think about his preaching. Jesus was
right,
pure spiritual, not physical.
Yeah, but the woman, Joni Magnus, who teaches at UNC
Carolina.
Chapel Hill,
Yeah,
Carolina, she discussed that she does a 30-minute lecture on whether Jesus was an Essene. And her opinion is that he was not, mainly because of the ritual purity laws that they kept to the ultimate, and that the way Jesus lived his life, he would not have been able to do that. So yes, that has been discussed, but her opinion is that he wasn't.
Yeah. So it's hard to sort out, because the other issue is, in terms of sorting some of this out, is that within the Jewish community, they had the scrolls for the Torah and the other books that are in our Old Testament, but sort of the commentaries of the time, or the interpretation of how to implement a lot of what was in, like Deuteronomy and Leviticus and stuff, a lot of that was based on oral tradition. And a lot of it didn't get written down until after the temple was destroyed. Not even like 200 years later. And a lot of those writings are difficult to date, because in them there was this one rabbi who was considered to be like the rabbi of all rabbis. And Claire, you may have heard this guy's name, Hillel, Hillel. Heard that name?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so in these writings, there'll be these debates or discussions between him and some other person who lived hundreds of years at a different time. So the writings are real hard to sort through as far as dating them and that kind of stuff. But so that's, there's a lot of oral tradition that, carried the faith during that time. And it's called, in some respects, called the oral Torah, is referred to as the oral Torah in some respects.
So we're talking about the first destruction of the temple or the second destruction?
The second destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Right, it was after the second destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So, all right. So, anything you want to add to that, Harold?
I thought, well, I mean, there's so many writers and so many opinions, and that's wonderful. I'd also had read, I thought that the Torah in the Old Testament pretty well been written down about 400 BC. But again, everybody has different ideas on what happened back then. So not as late as 70 AD, but 400 BC.
Right, as far as the actual books, the what we might call the Pentateuch, that which is the Greek name for the first 5 books, and the prophets and Isaiah and all that. Right, they had those in writing at the time of Jesus, but all the interpretation and sort of commentary was very much an oral tradition until it was written down about 200 years after Jesus' life. So. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the second temple, the destruction of the second temple. All right, so there's this time frame from 66 AD to 70 AD, so that 4 years. All right, and we've talked before about how these 4 years occurred the Gospels were sort of written right before or right after this series of events in Jerusalem. Okay. So in 66, there was a Jewish uprising against the Romans. And they were pretty successful at that point, as far as being able to take back control of of governing Israel. But then in 70 AD, the Romans said, no, this isn't working. We're not doing this. So they came in and besieged Jerusalem. And this happened in April, just as Passover was happening. So, we've talked before about how during Passover, everybody would come to Jerusalem, and there would be millions, like 1 million people in Jerusalem. So the Romans encircled Jerusalem, cut them off from all supplies, all foods, everything, and laid them under siege for 4 months. That they had nothing except what was already in there. So there are limited records, but the siege is documented. We've talked, you guys remember we've referenced before this guy named Josephus, who was a Jew, but then ended up sort of siding with Rome. But Josephus wrote lengthy sort of diaries or accounts of events during that time. And he writes at length about the siege of Jerusalem. And he writes about pretty gruesome details during that time, including some cannibalism and that kind of thing, and people dying in massive starvation during that time. So it's in April that the Romans come in and encircle the city and allow nobody in or out. And then in August, they go in and they burn Jerusalem and destroy the temple. So it's a pretty gruesome series of events. Lots of folks, people at that time in that part of the world were pretty shocked that the Romans did this, that they destroyed the center of the Jewish faith, because Rome usually left alone whatever religious, practices and buildings and temples and stuff for other faiths, because they didn't want to risk angering the gods for that place. The gods that held power in that place, they didn't want to anger them, so they usually left it alone. So folks were really pretty surprised by this. And it turns out the guy that led the siege on Rome, he later became an emperor for the Roman Empire. So he gained a lot of status by doing this. So anything anybody else wants to add about that? I'm just was sort of a survey. Okay, all right, so I want to talk some now as far as Amy Jill Levine's book. And Bernie, this is the book, The Misunderstood Jew. All right, and her name is Amy Jill Levine. So, and she is quite an interesting person herself. She is Orthodox Jew, but her PhD from Duke is on the Gospel of Matthew. So, yep, her life story is pretty interesting. She, needless to say, grew up devout Jew. Her family was, but she grew up in a neighborhood, a heavily Catholic neighborhood in New York. And so she, spent, her days with Catholic kids. And so she would have to go to Hebrew school, and her friends would go to catechism classes. And she went to the catechism classes with her friends. So she grew up, and she would go to church events, Catholic church events with her friends. And so she grew up in this very, melting pot world between the faiths. She tells a story in the book about how when she was like 6 years old and her friends were all getting their pretty white dresses to go to their first communions. And she wanted to do that. And she asked her mother, she said, I want to go to get my first communion. Her mother, in response, bought her a wedding dress for her Barbie doll. So she would take the Barbie doll And she said she did this every morning and dressed the doll in, the Barbie doll in the white dress. And she would dress her Ken in his little tux, but she would put the coat on backwards and took collar and put a clerical collar on him. Pretended that, Barbie was having her first communion. Anyhow, so, and then when she was 7, she has very clear memories also, let me interject this, as a kid wanting to be the Pope. She saw a lot of cool advantages to being the Pope, and she very much remembered Pope John the 23rd, his funeral. She clearly remembered that and the impact that had on the world at that point. So when she was 7, this girl on the school bus very firmly told her, "You killed my savior." That because she was Jewish, you killed Jesus. And that devastated her. It took her a long time to really be able to sort that out. So her writings in this book, she gives a lot of the historical context, but she also goes through sort of the history of how Judaism came, the schism between Judaism and Christianity. So it's to me, I haven't read the whole book yet, but it's a very interesting read and seeing how that all happened. So I say all that to give some background to her. And one other interesting, the book that the church used for the Advent book study this past Christmas was written by Amy Jill Levine. So she now teaches at Vanderbilt. She teaches New Testament. So her investment in Christianity remains, she's still an Orthodox Jew, very clearly. But she talks about how her study of Christianity has really helped her to understand the history of her own faith tradition. So she is considered a top New Testament scholar in the country. So to me, that's fascinating, to have that pulled together. So
she's an unorthodox Jew.
Yes, in many respects. Yeah.
And she doesn't take her work. I bet she doesn't take her work home with her.
So needless to say, one of her, missions is to help folks understand that schism between Judaism and Christianity. And for Christians, and she strongly advocates that Christians, it's to their benefit to understand Judaism, and it's the Jews' benefit to understand Christianity as well. So, and I guess it was maybe last spring or maybe it was 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to join in a study of the Psalms that was done by 7th Street Christian Church and the synagogue that's real close by to 7th Street, which the name of it has escaped my head. So it was members from the synagogue and the Christian church, and we together looked at the Psalms. And it was a fascinating conversation and how much common ground there was in that process. So anyhow, so Amy Jill Levine's tenet about Jesus is Jesus was a Jew, and that Christianity oftentimes loses sight of that he and his followers were Jews. The disciples were probably all Jews. All right. So I don't know how that sits with you guys.
Well, it sits with me fine today, but growing up, I would have been horrified to hear that.
Right.
Because, I grew up, Jesus was the first Christian.
Yeah.
And his intent from the day he was born was to form the Christian church.
Yep. Yep. Because the image of Jesus we grew up, he was blonde hair and blue-eyed too.
Yeah.
Yep. That was the picture that was in every church.
Yeah. I sat across from Dan Griggs at the pancake supper last week, and it fit the conversation, but I said, yeah, I grew up Baptist, but I got over it.
I think the modern seminary is still preaching that, and pretty much if you listen to most sermons, it's still that. It's they we overlook that Jesus said, "I came to Israel. I came to the Hebrews." And don't go into the Gentile cities. Don't deal with them. We just I think the modern church is still has that problem.
And perhaps some of it, Harold, I wouldn't blanket that to all Christianity. I think there's still some aspects of Christianity that does. And
Well, I
that's
think
a point.
our church does.
Our
I mean,
church does.
Yes, it does. And I mean, listen to the sermons. Jesus, Mark 6, all of a sudden that's demarcation because, Jesus got in a boat and went across the lake. That become, he came to the Gentiles. He was nice to a Gentile lady or that means he changed his ministry. Now he's preaching to the Gentiles, all of which are not in the Gospels. And that's, I mean, it's just, I think, a very universal tenet in the modern church. And we forget the fact that the first time Jesus said anything about going out to the Gentiles was after the resurrection. And then he sent the disciples out to all the world. So, I think we still live in that era.
Are we living in an era where we're teaching that all Jews are still responsible for Jesus's death?
We weren't even talking about that. I mean, that's not that's not the crux to this rampage of mine.
Well, and I think
it's
too, each of the four gospels have some variance in their perspectives about Jesus and Judaism, about the Jews.
I felt when I first came to BACC that one of the things I really fascinated me was the fact that I did gain an understanding that Jesus was a Jew and that how the early church started and things of that. And I, growing up, would never have heard that association. So for me, that was very important.
Mm. You did not hear that association growing up that Jesus was a Jew.
I didn't know, absolutely never. But then again, I grew up with very minimal understanding of Christianity, only what other 7-year-olds could tell me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that was one of the things that piqued my interest was learning about how, because I never thought about it, if Jesus was the first Christian, then what was there before? How did that, was what I'm saying? That was it like an on-off switch, like a light bulb? One day there were Christians and one day that, there weren't, they weren't, and then they flipped the switch and then there were, so this has been a very interesting teaching for me that I don't think I would have had if I had grown up in a more traditional teaching type of situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
See, I've never had a problem, I've never had a problem with Jesus being a Jew. I had a Jewish roommate in college for 6 months or a semester actually, and we talked a little bit about it. I was transitioning away from the Catholic Church at the time, and but I never had a problem with it because I guess I'd look at Jesus came to change the law to a new law, and what better way to do it from within? Okay, basically that's what he did. He wanted to reestablish a totally different, I guess, theological concept, Christianity, and what better way to do it than from within the Jewish faith.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
I never had a problem.
I have always thought that Jesus was a Jew. I mean, he
Yeah,
was
same
born
here.
Jewish. He's always been Jewish.
Mhm.
And to me, the people who follow him and his teachings are Christians. But I never thought of him as a Christian or the first Christian.
Well,
He was always a Jew.
well, as a child,
but
that
the
kind of
seven-
Jesus didn't go from being Jewish to Christian. He went from being Jewish to Catholic. So that's how I learned it. Yeah, no, in Catholic's religion class, they talked about Jesus being a Jew when I was in third, fourth grade, whatever. But yeah, that wasn't an issue for them. Like I said, he wasn't the first Christian, he was the first Catholic. Okay.
And I never understood anti-Semitism, because if you're Christian, you love Jesus, and Jesus was a Jew. So how could you hate the Jews? Anti-Semitism never made any sense to me.
Oh,
And Jesus.
no, I mean, I was taught that from a kid, the Jews killed Jesus.
Mhm. And I don't know that I was explicitly taught that and growing up in the disciple church, but it was just sort of generally known, you know. She cites an experience with the Southern Baptist Convention in 1980, where a guy who was one of the leaders in the Southern Baptist, you know, said out loud in a public group that God Almighty does not hear the prayer of a Jew. Yeah, that's there. But then he also went on to say that they're God's special people, but without Jesus Christ, they're lost. So, and it was.
It sounds like a Southern Baptist.
Well, now we got to be careful we don't condemn Southern Baptists. You know, Levine makes the point that a lot of Jews, just as like we don't necessarily understand the diversity within Judaism, like she makes the point that not all Jews agree about what to do with Israel and Palestine, that there's a wide range of opinions on that within Judaism. A lot of Jews don't understand the diversity within Christianity either, you know, and a lot of that comes from the conversations. And she talks about how, you know, Jewish colleagues have said to her, why are you putting up with all this, you know, with your work in you know, in the New Testament? Why are you doing that? You know, they're just condemning you. So there's, you know, the need for conversation and understanding across the board. So I didn't, you know, I figured that most of you guys had grown up or had, you know, gotten beyond.
Some of us have not grown up. Let me be clear.
All right, one other point I want to bring up, Bernie knows about this, but this huge event in Catholicism called Vatican II, which happened in what, 1963?
63 or 64, somewhere in there, yeah.
Somewhere in there.
That was Pope John the 23rd.
Yes. So one of the things that came out of Vatican II was the Catholic Church saying that Mass was to be said in the language of the folks who are attending, in the native languages of the folks attending. That's when that change happened. And the one other big thing was when Catholicism as a whole condemned teaching that all Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. So, because that little girl who told Amy Jill Levine when she was 7 years old that she was responsible for Jesus' death, needless to say, the parents all started talking, and it turns out the priest was teaching the kids that. And so
Well, I was in first grade in 1950. I'm not going to say it, but even in first grade, they did not talk about Jesus being killed by the Jews. And I mean, everybody knew he was Jewish, but there was no emphasis in any way that I could remember, because my brain was a little pile of mush back then, and I would have absorbed it. And but anyway, they didn't. And so when Vatican II came around, that part of it was not a big deal in our parish. in our neighborhoods and that. Now, changing to the English Mass, that's when I quit being an altar boy. If I couldn't speak in Latin, I wasn't going to be an altar boy. No, I didn't want to learn the prayers again. So
Oh,
I didn't want to learn the prayers in English. It was tough enough learning them in Latin.
Well, you know, I mean, Jesus didn't start Christianity either. I mean, he was not trying to start a new religion. He was trying to clarify, I think, the Jewish traditions and what God wanted the Jews to know, I believe. So, I mean, I think he would have been shocked if, you know, a couple hundred years later or whenever, all of a sudden this term Christian evolved.
right,
I
right.
mean, and at first it was even called the followers, I believe. And so, I mean, to think that Jesus was the first Christian, that's weird. All right.
Well, so, you know, I think we're in some, there are still some parts of Christianity where that is a teaching. There still are. So, so I think it's something for us to be mindful of, that is, it's not universal in terms of how this group views the issue. All right, so part of what Levine goes through, and I'm just going to walk through this real quick, and you guys can chime in, that sort of exemplifies how Jesus was a Jew. All right, he dressed like a Jew, she says, you know, that now in Jewish, in sort of the more traditional Jewish, the men will wear the prayer shawls and they have the tassels at the ends. You know what I'm talking about? Usually blue and white. All right, so there was a garment that was worn at that time that had the tassels. And remember the story of the hemorrhaging woman that touched Jesus, touched the fringe on his garment. You know, that was exemplifying that he dressed like a Jew. He told many of the stories in his ministries clearly linked back to imagery from the Old Testament. All right. The Jesus as a shepherd, like David was a shepherd. All right. He told parables like Nathan and some other folks in the Old Testament did. Parables were a very common teaching tool within Judaism at that time. Jesus healed and raised people from the dead, like Elijah and Elisha did. And series of events in his life that, and we've talked a little bit about this before, but clearly brought back imagery of Moses. All right, can you guys think of what they are? Starting from when he was a baby. What was similar about Jesus as a baby from the story, birth story in Matthew, and Moses as a baby?
He was brought out of Egypt. You remember they fled to Egypt and then came out of Egypt.
Right, but before that, why did they go to Egypt? Why did Joseph take them to Egypt?
Because Herod was going to
Herod
kill all
was
the
killing
people.
people.
Yeah, right. So there was this, you know, the story of the mass killing of babies, and that happened with Moses also.
And Moses
But that has
divided the
nothing to do-
waters, Jesus walked on it.
Right, right. So a life-changing event with water,
But
so to
that
speak.
is it only one gospel that talks about going to Egypt, the others talk about going back to Nazareth, and that killing of the babies has never been verified in history. No mention whatsoever. So I'm just saying we do build a lot of myths around some of these things, or a push to make it, you know, correlate with perhaps the Old Testament.
If you look at his life, I mean, he celebrated Passover, he taught in the temple and the synagogue, he hung out with Jewish people. Some of the Jewish leaders fussed at him. They wouldn't fuss at outsiders for breaking Jewish laws. I mean, he was clearly Jewish. He was
Right.
circumcised, so I hear.
So we would assume, we don't,
So we would assume he
So
was
we would
presented
assume.
he was presented in the temple at the appropriate time after his birth.
uh-huh, yep, yep, yep. So yeah, so you guys know all this. All right, a couple of other interesting points. Going back to the Maccabees and the Maccabean revolt, she makes the point that deaths on the cross were not unusual for Jews, that was something that happened during the Maccabean revolt. So that was part of their recent history, so to speak, recent history. So that that kind of martyrdom was not unusual. All right, so I don't know how you guys are going to take this one, but so this ongoing issue between Judaism and Christianity, the real schism between Judaism and Christianity really didn't occur until 2, 3, 4 centuries after Jesus's death and resurrection. There is evidence of a number of early churches worshiping using Jewish tradition, that was not unusual, that it wasn't until some time. And Levine does a nice job going through different scriptures and how they've been used through the years to justify prejudice against and persecution of Jews from out of those. So she also likens this, the relationship between Judaism and Christianity as siblings fighting over the parents' legacy. All right, so with the questions like, who are the true children of Abraham? Is it Jews?
Don't forget the Muslims now, they're up in there too.
Yeah. Who followed the correct path and who veered off of it? All right. So, so that's, there's ongoing questions about that and how society overall responds to those questions. We all know that the great commandment, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind or might, all right, comes out of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, right? Everybody knows that. And the second commandment, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, also from the Old Testament. And that those were and remain major teachings within Judaism as well. A core piece of Judaism as well. Okay, and parables we talked about. All right, Jesus also prays like a Jew. And Levine goes through the Lord's Prayer and how each line of the Lord's Prayer is very similar to Jewish prayers and to themes in Jewish prayer. So she makes the point that Jesus dressed like a Jew, prayed like a Jew, instructed like a Jew, argued like a Jew. All right. And his relationship with Pharisees was not, looking at the 4 Gospels overall, was not all contentious. There were times when, the Pharisees would ask him questions and he would answer and they would say, you're right. There were Pharisees that asked him to dinner at their house. He was hanging out with them. He fussed at the Pharisees at times. So that relationship was not all contentious between Jesus and the Pharisees as well.
Doesn't Pharisee simply mean questioning? I mean, the Sadducees were so rigid, much like the scribes, and I guess the scribes came out of the Sadducee group, but then the term Pharisee just simply mean to question, to study, to evolve. I mean, is it? I mean,
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
also if this lady had gone to our Sunday school class, she wouldn't have had to write this book.
Well, if we had this Sunday school class broadcasting across the world. Oh, All right, so I did, all right, oh, it's 10:54, so we need to finish up. So anyhow, so I'm preaching to the choir today, I know, but I appreciate y'all listening
Well,
to this, and hope
Yeah.
you'll look at this some more.